But what I think dark tourism does that a museum really can't do, the average museum or a book really can't do, is you learn on an emotional level when you go through these places. So yeah, I've pondered the thought of nuclear devastation, but until you go through there and really can hit you on that emotional level, you don't walk through the same person.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, my guest today is therapist and author, Dr. Chad Scott. Hello, Dr. Scott, and thanks for being here today.
Hey, Melvin, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. With a name like Chad, you must have hated the 2000 election, right?
Yeah, with a lot of hanging chads for sure. Yeah, one too many jokes, but hey.
I'm sure you heard all of them, every single one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I haven't heard. I actually hadn't thought about that in a while. So thanks a lot.
sorry to bring back those dark memories.
Right.
That's a good segue into your book. So your book is called Beyond the Darkness.
Yeah.
Did you create the term dark tourism, or is that actually a thing that preceded you?
No, dark tourism has been around since since people gathered in groups. You could go back to the Battle of Marathon, where people back in antiquity would go visit the battle site to pay homage to the people that fell there, and the gladiator games, and even in Victorian era England and uh, in France around that same time, they used to actually have morgues where they would have the unidentified dead, and people, it was almost a duty to go in there, and it'd actually be a social gathering place where people would go view the dead. Um, so anyway, the term though was coined by researchers in the 1990s to talk about this phenomenon, and it's actually an academic discipline now. So especially over in Europe, you can find courses on dark tourism.
Wow. So you explore places that most people avoid. What is it about dark tourism that draws you in, and how did it become personal for you?
Well, actually, I'm going to hit that first thing you said. Most people actually don't avoid dark tourism. So when I explain what dark tourism is, I think most people will be like, "Oh yeah, sure, I've done that." So there's a study in the United States a few years back, and it said that 85% of all people have gone to a dark tourism spot. And another 10% were wanting to or planning to go. So there's only 5% of people that basically said, I'm not going ever to a dark tourism spot. So dark tourism is simply going to places where there's been death that are associated with death, tragedy, suffering, things like that. So if you go to a graveyard to visit it, and look around, and that's dark tourism, especially famous ones like the Père Lachaise in France, or Arlington National. I mean, that's considered dark tourism.
Okay.
But it's also battlefields like Gettysburg and Normandy, Pearl Harbor, and what else here? Prison tourism, dark estates with dark pasts, even the Palace of Versailles, where they had, where Marie Antoinette had her struggles, and in the ending of World War II, which actually a lot of people, they have this beautiful hall of mirrors there, and and you go in there and you literally reflect off the mirrors, but you also are reflecting. That's where World War II came to an end. The Treaty of Versailles was signed there, but it also, the end of World War II really started kind of the Nazis, and because of the economic conditions of that they imposed on Germany after World War One, and that's where the Nazis came to rise. So reflecting on all that, the weight of history, and in that room in particular. So in a nutshell, that's dark tourism.
Okay. Well, I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
So you'd survived a liver transplant and a divorce. So how did visiting those dark places help you survive your darkest moments?
Yeah, there's many reasons, and that's really what my book is about. So just to kind of give you the history, I had a lot of autoimmune issues starting about 10 years ago. And I really struggled with it. I really struggled with anxiety. I mean, severe anxiety. I'm a therapist, and I had about as bad of an anxiety disorder as you probably could get. And I really didn't work on it. I didn't want to lose my pilot's license, and I didn't, so there's reasons that I didn't work on it, and that really hurt my marriage. And she went through kind of her own difficult time, and said, she just couldn't do with it anymore. So I was really absolutely lost during that time. And I started going on a lot of adventure tourism. I also had some job struggles at that time where I was striving to be a CEO, and and they gave the job to somebody's wife that was on the board, and that really, so I ended up leaving that agency that I spent 18 years at, and I kind of did some soul searching, and I found that both in adventure tourism, where I was out hiking around Costa Rica and Yellowstone and places like that, but also I was gravitating more, and I didn't do it on a conscious level. I thought I was doing it more just for my interest in history, and I've always kind of flirted around with the taboo stuff, but I ended up gravitating towards dark tourism spots. And it wasn't until, and actually I did really well for a few years. I kind of recovered. Um, and then I was, all of a sudden got really sick and was diagnosed with end stage liver disease. And then I started recovering from that, and had a couple of really good years. And then all of a sudden I was in Oslo, and it just, I started getting really sick again. And when I was there, I had read a National Geographic article about dark tourism, because I mean, I had heard of it, but I didn't really know what it was either. And it was interviewing a guy named Philip Stone, and he was talking about, the different motivations where, people go there for sensationalistic reasons, but also most people probably go there for reasons like I did, where you're going, for interest in history, but also to honor and pay tribute, and just going with complete reverence for the people and the atrocities that happened in these places. And it mentioned a lot of the places I was at. And just a few weeks prior to that, I was in Auschwitz. I had gone to Auschwitz, and I'm like, my God, I'm a dark tourist. And right after that is when I ended up getting really sick, and I went to I had my transplant. Not long after that, I was listed, and within a couple months, I was transplanted. Um, and I started really noticing how much that would affect me. How much these experiences came back to, like, it was weird, because when I was going through my own really dark chapter there, these experiences came back almost to thank me for going to them. For example, I had a dry run where I went down to the University of Minnesota for a liver transplant, but I wasn't able to get it. And I started reflecting a lot on my time where I was in Normandy, where they had a delay, and there was a lot of uh, uncertainty, and their mission was, when they got to the beaches, was to get to the other side and fight on. And I saw that as my mission too, is to get to that transplant and keep fighting on. And it's kind of weird, because when you go to all these places of suffering, um, it sort of comes back, and you just don't feel so alone. You other people have suffered, and it's a completely different type of suffering, different completely different circumstances, but knowing people got through their suffering and went on to lead productive lives, and lives full of meaning. One of my favorite books, probably my favorite book, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. That's probably the reason I went to Auschwitz, is kind of to stand in his footsteps also. But he talked about meaning in suffering. And so my book, I go through probably 35 different dark tourism spots, and most of them people have heard of. Um, and it's kind of a mini man search for meaning. So I go through all these spots and write about the reflections that I had, and how they helped me going through my darkest hours. So
You talked about having a liver transplant. Have you ever visited the gravesite of the donor, the liver donor?
I don't know who my donor is. All I know is that he was roughly 50 years old, and he was slightly overweight, and he was a guy. Um, and he died of unnatural causes. It was an abrupt death. I wrote a letter to his family, but they, because of the rules, they don't identify it, and it's their choice to either write or not write back. So I don't know. But what I did do is I put out this concise edition, and I dedicated it to him. So, and then also with that concise edition, I didn't mention this. So that same person I was reading about when I was in Oslo, this Dr. Stone, he actually read my concise edition and contacted me. So we've developed a little bit of a relationship, and he wrote the foreword to my new book. So
Nice.
that was really cool. Yeah.
That is
Um, and another thing too, I went to Richmond, Virginia, and they have a donor memorial there. It's a beautiful fountain, and it has names of people that have donated their organs, and I went there and just really meditated on what I just had went through a few months prior to that. So
How often do you think about the donor?
every day, every day. um yeah, the guy saved my life. If he hadn't done what he done, which is check the box, and I'm sure he knew the full weight of what checking that box meant, and and thankful for his family that it has to, even though he checks the box, it the family also consents, and uh, and he saved my life, and I that's not something I take lightly. It's something I think about every day.
So when you visit these dark tourism sites, do you see it as just an opportunity to reflect on the bigger picture, or is it actually more personal than that?
It depends on the place. You know, uh, I don't want to say there's a standard reflection that a person has. Um, for example, I went to Père Lachaise, which is a cemetery in Paris, and they had Jim Morrison's grave there. And when I was a kid, I loved Jim Morrison. Cruising around my little pickup truck with my friends, heading to parties, and being rebels and sneaking in a cigarette here or there, and listening to Jim Morrison. Break on through to the other side, and those, and standing at his grave, you just those memories come back, and you get to thank people, and also people like John Glenn and Jimmy Doolittle, pilots that I really admired, and you stand at their graves, and just what's really cool about that kind of thing is you're by yourself with these people. It's like, who is able to stand by themselves with John Glenn, and you guys were talking about Mel Blanc in an episode that was just a
Right.
few weeks ago, and it's like actually that was the day that I came up with the idea of writing this book. I was at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. They have Judy Garland and Burt Reynolds and Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny and a bunch of others, and and just kind of sitting there, and it's like, why am I in a grave 2 days in a row? I was actually there to help recover from my transplant. I wasn't getting exercise up here in northern Minnesota because of the weather wasn't very nice. So I'm like, I got permission, and about 5 weeks after I had my transplant, I went out to Los Angeles to just walk around, and that's where I found myself. And I'm like, why am I always gravitating towards these places? And it just occurred to me that I was getting a lot out of it, on a psychological level, and that's where kind of that subconscious became conscious. Is like, I'm a dark tourist, and I very much benefit from standing in awe with the various people and places that I go to.
So, of all the places you visited, from Auschwitz to other cemeteries, which ones shook you the most, and why?
Um, they all places where tragedies occurred. So the United States, I mean, the 9/11 memorial, of course, Pearl Harbor, one that really, I talking about shaking. I think the one that shook me the most, honestly, was the Whitney Plantation. It's down by New Orleans, and most people would think, why would you want to go to a plantation? The antebellum South, how disgusting, and and it is. And I wouldn't have gone to a place like that, I don't think. But when I was in New Orleans, I saw the Whitney Plantation being advertised, and it was about plantations from the slavery point of view. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. And what was cool is it was when, well, I don't know if cool was the word, but um, it really gave it from the slavery point of view. And uh, the main house uh, where the plantation owners lived was basically a walkthrough area. And I thought, like, how cool. They didn't have all the beautiful, you know vanities and tables and chairs and things. It was just a walkthrough area, and it really showed the horrors of slavery, which is awful. But by going there, it felt like you paid tribute, um, and honored the suffering that people had. I remember reading a plaque where they were burying people alive. It talked about how they were burying people alive at one point, and people had scratched out their own eyeballs. And uh, I mean, you feel sick going through these places, and it's almost like going to a funeral of a loved one. And you go there and you honor them and you pay your respects, and you get these reflections, and you come out a better person for doing. When you face darkness. I'm in my therapy office right now, so I'm pointing over to my coach. So when people come in, and uh, a lot of times they'll beat around the bush, and then I'll say, okay, when you want to talk about the heavy stuff, let's talk about the heavy stuff, because that's really where the real work happens, and where the real change happens. And so then they start talking about their difficult childhoods or their traumas that they've had, and it's hard, but they benefit so much by facing their fears. There's no change in comfort zones. Nothing grows in a comfort zone. So I'm always trying to push not only myself but my clients, and that's where I think dark tourism really is a change, a way to change yourself. Um, but other places, one of the more recent ones I've been to was Hiroshima, and uh, walking through there, I walk through there. There's a giant mural when you go in there, and it's Hiroshima before the bomb fell, and it's just this big, beautiful black and white mural of this beautiful city. And at the end of it, there's a school children that are life size, taking kind of a school picture, and it was on the day that the bomb dropped. And then I was going through with a group of school children, or 10, 11, 12 years old, in that range, and they were looking at this mural, and it was almost like a mirror reflection. They were both wearing uniforms, and then there's a clock on the wall, and the clock is stopped at the exact same time the bomb fell. And then you walk into the next room, and you have the same mural, but everything is just, there's complete destruction. There's almost nothing standing. And then you're walking through with these school children, um, looking at all the stories that have happened. They're drinking this black rain coming down, because they're so thirsty. Well, it was nuclear fallout falling down, and they were getting cancer. And so a lot of them that survived only lived a few months, and then many others lived a few years. But you just feel absolute sick going through these places, and you feel guilty. As an American, I felt really guilty going through Hiroshima. And it made you reflect on, um, is that something we should have done? Yes, I've thought about that before, but it really makes you feel it. And that's the thing is these places, you learn a lot of information, but what I think dark tourism does that a museum really can't do, the average museum, or a book really can't do is you feel you learn on an emotional level when you go through these places. So yeah, I've pondered the thought of nuclear devastation, but until you go through there and really can uh, hit you on that emotional level, you don't walk through the same person. For example, I went when I was at Auschwitz. There's a gas chamber that's still, it's called Crematorium One, and you walk in there, you walk down the steps that thousands and thousands of Jews and other people had walked down, and you're in that gas chamber. And I remember my tour group had walked to the next room, and I'm just standing in this gas chamber where thousands of people died, and you just start having visions of people just falling over one by one, and if in that very moment my life changed, and you don't walk out that other side the same person, and you walk past the 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 crematorium ovens, and you walk out the other side a better version of yourself. And I say this with the Paris catacombs too, where you're walking through all these, thousands or millions of bones. um, I think there's 6 million people buried in the Paris catacombs, and you walk through these tunnels underneath Paris, and you'd think it's just really creepy, and maybe it is a little bit, um, but when you walk out the other sides of a lot of these places, like the Whitney Plantation, Auschwitz, even when you're coming back from Normandy, or you come back a better version of yourself. You love more deeply. You are more committed to helping people. Um, you know, eh, just seeing that suffering, makes you. It's not like you're going in there to compare your life to theirs, but you're just so grateful for what you have. Uh, uh, and again, and when you're going through your own dark time, you don't feel so alone when you can reflect on your experiences in dark tourism. So when I wrote the book, I really tried to do it sort of as a therapist tour guide in a way, going through these places and talking about my own life and reflections, and I think the average reader gets a pretty good sense of what it's like in these places, and it's had really good critical reviews because of that.
Okay, nice. All right. So, as a therapist, you probably understand more than most people that offspring or communities impacted by these dark situations, or the slavery, or the Nazi death camps, or the nuclear bomb being dropped in Hiroshima, uh, those traumas are carried on for generations. You visited those sites. Have you ever had like one-to-one conversations with people whose direct ancestors may have been impacted by those events?
Oh yeah, for sure. Maybe not exactly the ones that I've been to, but for example, there is a Native American belief, an Ojibwe belief, and I work 2 days a week on a with an Ojibwe tribe actually, and they had a lot of historical trauma within. I mean, we tried to eradicate the Native American culture. Um, they put people in boarding schools and punish people for talking their native languages, and it was horrific. And we had the Battle of Wounded Knee and Little Bighorn and things like that, and um, and yeah, so I don't know that I had an exact direct descendant of somebody that fought or was killed in those places, but um, they've gone through a lot of Native Americans, African Americans. I mean, they're still suffering um, what their ancestors suffered. There's actually a thing called epigenetics where your DNA is actually altered a little bit because of the traumatic experiences your ancestors have gone through. There's a Native American belief that trauma is passed down 7 generations, and the study of epigenetics actually kind of shows that that's true. So yeah, it's you're not treating it like PTSD. I'm not treating somebody that was abused 10 generations ago or something, but or even a few generations ago, but it does have that ripple effect, and it does affect them. their fight flight responses tend to be a little more hyperactive because of it. So we're dealing with a lot more anxiety and anger problems and in kids behavioral problems because of it.
Wow. I've written two books about genealogy, my family's genealogy, and
Yeah.
in both those books, I wrote it from a first person perspective of my ancestors, based on family stories and research I had done. And this is something that, if you never experienced it, you can't really understand it. But it's almost like I conjured up those ancestors while I was writing, and I was feeling those emotions and
Yeah.
feeling that trauma. And with the first book in particular, I wrote it during COVID because I had lots of free time, like a lot of other people, and I had to write a lot faster than I'd planned to
Hmm.
because I couldn't sleep. It was
Wow.
affecting my sleep, and so
Wow.
I just had to finish it because I just wasn't getting
Sure.
any sleep. And so you talk about those seven generations. We're I'm four generations removed from the end of slavery. So
Wow.
that's well within that seven generations here. And
Yeah.
so it's I don't know how biologically verifiable that is, but it's certainly my own personal experience. My um, from what I can see, I would say there's some validity to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you um, learn about these places on such an intimate level, and dark tourism, when you're when you're going there, you're really standing on hallowed ground. It's a lot of the same thing people would get from going on religious pilgrimages. They get a lot of those same types of reactions, and um, and I 100% agree with what you're saying. When I was in Oslo, the reason I went there was that's where my family's from, or a portion of my family, and I went and tracked down my great great grandparents when I was there, at their grave, and yeah, and I never felt closer to them, you know, until I learned about them. So yeah, genealogy I think is absolutely something that can do that.
Yeah. So and this kind of travel that you're talking about, this dark tourism, can that help someone grow spiritually, or just find peace within themselves?
Yeah, like I said, there's actually a really good book that this Philip Stone actually gave to me, and it talks about how there's such an overlap between dark tourism and religious pilgrimages, where and that's why I said is there's a lot of similar reflections and things because um, you go there and what's the meaning of life? I mean, you ask those big existential questions when you're going here, and it reminds me of City Slickers 2 with Curly. I don't have you seen that one?
Mm-hmm.
And he keeps saying Curly, the older guy. I think Jack Palance played Curly, and he keeps saying, "Well, there's one thing in life," or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And and he wouldn't tell them what that one thing is until the very end. Billy Crystal said, "I know what that one thing is," and that one thing is whatever that one thing is for you. And I think when you're standing in places of such trauma, that your life comes into perspective. You start seeing little pieces of yourself in these places, and and I guess if you do that enough times, or you just really stand and reflect, um, and it's not like you're going there again in comparison of your life to the things that have happened in these places, but again, you just see little pieces of yourself. It's just impossible to not have that, as long as you're going in with I would say complete reverence, and then trying to have as much empathy for the people that suffered there as you possibly can. And it's not a comfortable feeling, and it's actually a sickening feeling. But when I say you walk out a different person, things become so very clear. Like, you know, I can tell you right now, my one thing is actually two things. It's one is my family and friends, and two is helping people. So those are the two things that drive my life, and I think I never felt it I probably could have told you that before, but I have never felt it as much as I did until I had gone through many of these places. And and there's studies about like intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence, and they find that people that are high emotional intelligence um, tend to do better in their careers and in their lives than people of just high intellectual intelligence. So you can be very smart and really, not have that great of a life because you're not emotionally intelligent. And one thing is you can't do a whole lot about emotional intelligence or intellectual intelligence, but you can actually improve your emotional intelligence by stepping outside of your comfort zone and getting emotional experiences under your belt. And again, that's what dark tourism does.
So, speaking of dark tourism again, do you also find yourself drawn to dark themes in movies and books?
Actually, no. I personally, um, I don't necessarily like going to these places even. I have an interest, some of them are fun, like the London Dungeon and where it's been so many years and so far removed, and it's not in the actual place that things happened. And they kind of have this, what they call gallows humor, where like, haha, they chop off their head, and, you know, and, and those are kind of fun even, but when you're going to places like Auschwitz, I mean, they're not fun, they're sickening. But it's like, again, facing your fears. So no, I actually don't gravitate. I do gravitate a little bit towards the taboo, where, and that's kind of how I got even into this, where we were down in Key West and a guy was talking, hey, you should go check out the cemetery. It's quite a quirky cemetery with all the different epitaphs. And it's like, okay, we'll go check that out. And that actually became sort of a thing I did on all of, when I've gone with my now ex-wife, but we'd almost go to a graveyard every time we went somewhere, or my son, we'd go to these dark places. For example, one of the places that I had brought my son when he was quite little, and I did this kind of out of just like sort of a little fascination for the taboo, was there's a thing called body worlds where they um, pose people without their skin after they had passed away, and they do this process where it preserves their organs and their muscles and their nerves and all those things. And I'm like, how could this be appropriate for a kid? And I mean, and I just had to check it out. And I did, and it was actually probably one of the best learning experiences of my life, and then it really I've gone to probably 5 of these since, because they're throughout the world. They travel around, and then they have some permanent exhibits like in Berlin. And, when I went through my own liver issues and health issues, and even as a mental health therapist, you could, they'd have people posed with their brains showing, and how it connects their different nerves. And it's just like, I have this 3D imprint in my brain from going to these places. So when the doctor's telling me something, instead of looking at the chart on the wall, it's like I have this 3D image in my head just from going to these places. So kind of getting back to your question, though, it's like, I don't avoid horror movies or avoid books that have more dark themes, but it's not something I seek out. Although I will say, next week, actually in 3 days, I'm going to be staying at the Lizzie Borden house, where they had I'm actually staying by myself in Lizzie Borden's room, and yeah, okay, I'm going a little bit for the, to see what it's like. I mean, I guess I'm pushing my comfort zone there, and but I typically don't gravitate towards places like that.
So, what is your greatest fear?
I would have said up until about a month ago, when I was down in Texas, my greatest fear, other than my family dying, that's my greatest fear. But my greatest fear, besides that, was jumping out of an airplane, and I was on a bicycle in Port Aranis, and I drove by the airport and saw skydiving on one of the, and since I'm a pilot, I love going to airports, and I just wanted to go check out the airport. And then I see the skydiving thing, and I keep telling my clients all the time, step out of your comfort zone. And I've seen the benefit within myself. Like, I used to have a profound fear of snakes, and then I got to the point where I was able to handle snakes with my hands in a venomous snake handling class I took down in Florida, just to push my comfort zone. So I see the skydiving thing, and I'm thinking, oh crap, I got to go in. And so I went in and just started talking to them, and they're like, well, we have an opening at 3:00 today. I'm like, oh no. I have to do it, and I did it, and I did it with almost no fear. It was a little scary as you're going 150 miles at the ground, and then once the parachute opens, it's like it was absolutely beautiful and one of the best experiences of my life once that parachute opened. So right now, my greatest fear, I really don't know what it is. Um, I'm claustrophobic, so maybe something around that.
All right, so this question might be a little bit edgy, but I'm curious. Do
Sure.
you think in any kind of way you have a death wish?
No, not at all. No. And I think that back about 10 years ago, where um, I started getting sick with autoimmune issues. I had a disorder called vasculitis, and that's what killed Harold Ramis, the guy that was in Ghostbusters.
Mhm.
Um, and they didn't know if my type was a deadly type or not. It was just basically, well, you're testing positive for some of the deadly things, but then there's some clues that maybe it's not deadly. So it's kind of wait and see. And the treatment was chemotherapy to keep you alive. So I was looking at that, and I was absolutely obsessed, and that's where I got really anxious. I mean, so it's an autoimmune issue. So I was having like this brain um, inflammation, and because of it, and also just I just had this fear of death. I was pulling up research, and at 2 a.m. I'd get a thought, and then I'd go on my phone and Google, or I'd get my test results and I'd Google them to death at 3 a.m. And I was living an absolute miserable life because of my fear of death. And I think my experiences with dark tourism especially has helped. And when I was younger, I didn't have a fear of death because I just was stupid. I think I like, oh, I'm 25 years old, I'm not going to die, nothing bad's going to happen to me, that happens to other people, not me. I think I had that kind of no fear of death. But as I got older and started really having these issues, I was able to put it into perspective, I think, with my dark tourism experiences. So I've done a lot of kind of what some people would think crazy things, like in Colorado, because of the thermal stuff. It keeps some of the swamps warm. So they actually have an alligator sanctuary in Colorado by Great Sand Dunes National Park, and you can go there and you take your shoes off, you go out into the swamps. You're with somebody who knows what they're doing, but you grab alligators by the tail out in the swamp. These are giant alligators, just as big as they are in Florida, and you drag them onto the shore and you jump on their back. And you're doing this all by yourself with the person telling you what to do, and but I look at statistics, and I do that with my clients. I say, a lot of them have these very irrational fears of, like flying, or for example, I had a person that wouldn't go to Florida with their family because of their fear of flying, and I look at what is the statistics. And if the statistics say it's not that dangerous, how many people have a fear of sharks? Well, only 5 people on average get killed in the whole world every year because of shark bites. Um, and skydiving, the very first thing I did after I said, yeah, I'll go skydiving, is I was on my bicycle going back to my cousin's house because it was going to be a few hours before I had to go back. I Googled on my bike, what is the death rate for people in a tandem jump? And it was like 1 in 500,000 or something like that. And I'm like, I'm not going to worry about it. That's an irrational fear. So
Your odds are probably higher dying in a bike wreck while Googling while you're riding your bike.
exactly. Yeah. And I think people have irrational fears of things that maybe they don't know a lot about. I think that causes a lot of problems, even in the United States or worldwide, when we have this ignorance because we don't have enough information about other people and things. So ignorance is a major thing that holds people in their comfort zones.
All right, so you mentioned Frankl earlier. Do you
Yeah.
consider yourself to be more like Winston Churchill or Viktor Frankl?
I don't consider myself to be like either. Funny thing about Winston Churchill is I went to Parliament. Actually, we went there. I brought my son to London and Paris for his high school graduation, and he's a real history nut, and he's a pretty much a dark tourist like I am. So we actually went to to Parliament, and you're in there with the green benches, and you see the speaker's bench, and in the spot where Winston Churchill gave his speech, we will fight on the beaches, and he was known for saying something of the sort of when you're going through hell, keep going. That it might be attributed to him, but he gets credited for saying that a lot. And when I was going through my liver transplant, I would reflect back to the Churchill war rooms, because that's where he was at most of the time, talking to Roosevelt in the transatlantic telephone room. They'd talk almost every day. And, I'd think about that, and I would think about his speeches and how the British just, they were on their knees. They were against the wall during that time with the Nazis. They were basically defeated. And then Winston Churchill came into power, and basically through his speeches and and some strategic things too, obviously, but they were able to well, they won the war. We won the war. And when I was sitting in my hospital bed, and it's not like I planned this stuff. It just comes back to you. It, like when I say it comes back to thank you for going to these places. Winston Churchill's voice of, when you're going through hell, keep going, would come back to me, and I would get up out of bed, even though I was hurting so bad because my guts were sliced open, from that surgery. And I, I would be able to walk, and I'd be able to, I would think back to that, like, they did it, I can do it. And so, getting to your question, I don't think I'm like either one. Those guys are too great. Um, I actually tried to. I talk about Winston Churchill and Viktor Frankl both a lot in my book, and I think one of my motivators for how I wrote my book was Viktor Frankl, because I tried to write sort of a, I don't want this to sound egotistical, because it's not, but I really tried to write a small man's search for meaning through each of the sites I went through. I wasn't the one necessarily suffering, but I talked about my experience with suffering. So there's differences and nuances. So, but I really had Viktor Frankl in mind as I'm writing my book throughout. In his book too, as I absolutely gravitated towards his experiences at Auschwitz. I mean, so his book is kind of like two different books in one, where it's his experiences and meaning, and then he talks about in the second half more the technical things, and I kind of get lost. So I really tried to write like he did in his first half of the book, where it just really hits you on a human level, and then it gets kind of too technical for a lot of people, I think, in the second half of his book. So.
All right. So where's the line between a meaningful reflection and then just sort of kind of wallowing in somebody else's suffering or somebody else's pain?
I guess I don't know if I've thought of that. Yeah, I think people can over empathize with situations where when they start taking on their emotions too much, and it's really starting to affect their lives in negative ways. I would say that maybe the line is drawn there, where I get people in here that are caretakers, and they might over I don't want to say over empathize, but they put too much emotional weight into the person they're caretaking, and it affects their lives significantly in negative ways. They just have too much anxiety, and so if you're getting to that point, I mean, yeah, maybe you can't let yourself get over that point, but going in with about as much empathy as you can is, for the average person, I think, a good and healthy thing. But if you notice yourself going, having negative reactions to it, I'd say, yeah, probably back off a little.
Okay. So I got one
Yeah.
more question for you today.
Yeah.
Again, your book is called Beyond the Darkness. So what's the one thing you hope people understand after reading your book or hearing your story?
That, they're not alone in their suffering. They're not alone in their suffering. And I would say nothing grows in comfort zone. So, step outside your comfort zone and keep pushing it. And there's hope. Hope will come, and your life is not stuck in suffering. Your life will get better. Um, and and yeah, I think those are the main things I want people to get.
That sounds good. That's a good positive way to end this conversation today. So our guest has been therapist and author Dr. Chad Scott. Chad, thank you so much for being here today. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Melvin. Thanks for having me.
Please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today, including links to his books and his website. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.